Ancient Egypt is one of the most famous and alluring ancient civilizations, steeped in over 3,000 years of mystery and mythology. In this video, the first installment of the Ancient Egyptian series, we'll be going over the history of this influential civilization. What do we actually know about them? Where did they come from, and where did they go? Where did they come from, Papyrus-eyed Joe? Let's get started. Love and light, death and darkness, I'm Jordan from Grimwire, and this is only part 1 of the 10-part series that I'm going to do on ancient Egypt. I wanted to go over some of the history first, so that when we do go over the religion, magic, and deities, we'll have some background about what I'll be talking about, some common ground to build upon. So in this video, we'll be going over the most ancient pharaohs, the golden ages, and yes, the pyramids. But first, this whole ancient Egypt series is sponsored by myself. I just published a poetry book, my first book ever, and although it has nothing to do with magic or witchcraft, it has a lot to do with love, loss, and life. Let's imagine our own meaning of life as a relatively short read, only about an hour or so, but it's packed with my thoughts and feelings and life experiences. It's available through the Amazon link below, only $1.99 on Kindle and $7.99 paperback. If you want to help support me and support this channel, it would really help to swing over and grab a copy. And once you're finished, be sure to leave a review. But now, on to the video. When talking about ancient Egypt, there's a little bit of terminology you'll frequently hear, so let's start real basic and cover some of that first. The first term to talk about is pharaoh, which I'm sure most, if not all of you, have heard of, and that's going to be a kind of ruler god. At first thought, that might seem kind of like a nice, easy life, being worshipped as literally a god, but in fact, they were blamed for everything as well. It would kind of majorly suck to be blamed if it didn't rain enough, or if the crops didn't do too well. It was certainly a double-edged sword. Now, a pharaoh typically passed on rulership to either a child or other family member, as I'm sure we're pretty familiar with. This continuous line of pharaohs was called a dynasty, and that's our second term. There were a whole bunch of dynasties in what we call ancient Egypt, typically 30, sometimes 31. The first dynasty was said to have been created when someone brought together all the cities along the Nile in about 3000 BC, which we'll go over in the next section, and they kept rolling until the first fully foreign ruler, Alexander the Great, in 300 BC. Now, there's not too many reasons any individual dynasty is going to be more or less important to us, so I wouldn't stress about trying to remember those, but it does give us a sense of time, and it is how historians frequently break up the history. So first, let's look at a time period before any dynasty, before all of Egypt was united under a single pharaoh, and at what all of ancient Egypt had in common. First, let's define what ancient Egypt actually means, as it's primarily a geographical term, and that starts with the Nile, a river that starts in North Africa and flows into the Mediterranean Sea. The Nile is considered one of the tamest and most predictable rivers, and it made a lot of hard work a little bit easier for the ancients. They could pretty much dig a hole and let it fill in during the annual flooding, and then use that the rest of the year. So Egypt today is this big boxy country, but ancient Egypt consisted of relatively little land area, all centered around the fertile land surrounding the Nile. The Nile itself is about 4,000 miles long, but only the top 750 were ever controlled by Egypt, because it gets real rocky and mountainous and hard to travel any further south. Of its 750 miles, the southern part is called the Upper Nile, because it flows that way, south to north. The Upper Nile is characterized by a thin strip of highly usable land. The Upper Nile was kind of like a natural protective place, because outside of that thin strip of land, it was desert on miles and miles on both sides, making them pretty immune to any outside invasions. No one could cross the desert with enough provisions to successfully launch an attack on top of the journey itself. It was around 5000 BC when small farming villages, called the Badarian culture, started popping up on the Upper Nile. It was about 700 years before that a group of people called Merimda started settling far to the north, in a wide triangle of fertile land called the Lower Nile. That area is what's called a delta. It's where the Nile split up into various sub-rivers and made that triangle shape. These settlements on the Upper and Lower Nile existed for about 2,000 years, and are believed to have maintained a friendly trade relationship, but were ultimately two separate cultures. Then a group of people called the Naqada came after the Baradians, around 4000 BC, and brought some of the first notable examples of what we can call ancient Egypt. Here, we find the first hieroglyphs, we find royal cemeteries, and also states, the first local kings or pharaohs. Here is where we start to get a little bit of confusion that historians don't really know for sure. We do know that around 3200 BC, we have records of two people. Someone named Narmer was the last king of Nakata and the first king of the first dynasty. We also have record of someone called King Menes, who was said to have united the upper and lower parts of Egypt, which created the first dynasty. Confusing, I know, and according to Wikipedia, most Egyptologists believe that Narmer and Menes are actually one and the same. But, like I said, there's some argument going on. Who actually did what and if they are indeed the same. Anyways, whoever took over started the first dynasty, and did so with a capital at a city named Thynis, which is still unable to be located today. We just don't know where it was, cause it was never really specified and the city didn't survive. After about 200 years, the first dynasty ended, and then another 200 after that, the second dynasty ended as well, and a pharaoh named Djoser took over. With this, the third dynasty began, and this begins the first kingdom or golden age, called the Old Kingdom. So just to recap for a moment, a dynasty is a family line of rulers, of which there's about 30, and a kingdom is a period of dynasties, of which there are only 3. The Old, Middle, and New Kingdom. The kingdoms are much more important, as each has special characteristics that really make them stand out. Each kingdom is coincidentally about 500 years long, with periods of 1 to 200 years called intermediary periods, where Egypt kind of fell into chaos and civil war. So, now let's cover the kingdoms, starting with the first, the Old Kingdom. The Old Kingdom is still calm, quiet, and isolated. Not much information is known about this time period at all. There are 2 major changes that signify the start of the Old Kingdom, and they both begin with that third dynasty pharaoh, Djoser. The first is that Djoser took complete control. States that used to be independent along the Nile were now forced to be classified as nomes, territorial divisions within Egypt, and the rulers that had been called kings had to resign to just being governors and tax collectors for the pharaoh. The second major thing is the start and height of major architecture, including, yes, the pyramids. In fact, most of the pyramids, and all the good ones, were built during this time period, leading the Old Kingdom to sometimes be called the Age of the Pyramids. Djoser kind of accidentally built the first pyramid in the third dynasty. See, building mastabas, or underground burial tombs, were already pretty popular. But when he finished building his, he wanted to keep on adding to it, just to flex a little, you know? And the only way to build was up. This created the first step pyramid. A pharaoh named Snefru, the first pharaoh of the 4th dynasty, got a little obsessed with this concept of a pyramid and tried and failed to build smooth pyramids several times before perfecting the practice. His first try collapsed completely. The second was called a bent pyramid because they had to alter the angle about halfway through, but he did eventually get around to completing the first smooth pyramid. Then his son Khufu built the Great Pyramid of Giza, and his son Khafre built both his own pyramid there and another little project called the Great Sphinx. So you know, the most popular guys that are simply called the Great Pyramids today. The 5th dynasty was marked by a growing worship of Ra, and focus shifted from building pyramids to building sun temples. The main god during this time period was Ra, hands down, though Horus, Isis, and Osiris were biggies too. This golden age came to a halt around 2200 BC, when droughts, famine, and infighting among the pharaohs caused the first intermediary period, or period of relative chaos and civil wars that lasted about 200 years, bringing us to the Middle Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom is kind of boring. Although we start to get more in-depth historical records, it pretty much gets looked over compared to the Old and New Kingdoms. After the Old Kingdom split and started to dwell in chaos for many, many years, 2 dynasties arose, the 10th in Lower Egypt and the 11th in Upper Egypt. They each solidified control in their own respective region. After an internal revolt in the 10th dynasty, a pharaoh from the 11th Mentuhotep II took advantage of this, and he was able to take control of the north with little effort, reuniting Egypt under one ruler yet again. He even went as far as capturing parts of Nubia to the south and Sinai to the east. During the 12th dynasty, there was some resurgence in retrying to build pyramids, but these guys were done much cheaper and smaller than in the 4th dynasty. Other notable advances of the Middle Kingdom included trade routes and new forms of irrigation. And we get our first examples of casual literature, meaning everyday writing and some sculptures, not just the religiously important hieroglyphs. The Middle Kingdom came to an abrupt end with the end of the 12th dynasty, in which Queen Sobe-Neferu had no legitimate heirs, and so that kind of screwed everything up. This was further exacerbated when the Hyksos, a foreign power from Asia, took over the Egyptians and ruled as pharaohs of the 15th dynasty, and that lasted until the Egyptians adapted the military techniques that were used to take them over, including the horse and chariot, bronze smelting, and bows and arrows. Then, they started to drive them out in the 17th dynasty, and by the time the 18th was created, the Egyptians started their own military expansion, which begins the New Kingdom. The New Kingdom was by far the biggest and most prosperous of any of ancient Egypt. It was diplomatic and expansive, and even became known as the Egyptian Empire, based on how far it spread. Not only that, but this is the kingdom from where we actually get pretty decent historical records, and it includes all the famous pharaohs you may have heard about in passing, like King Tut and Ramses the Great. It all started with the 18th dynasty, in which the pharaoh of the time, Ahmose I, reunited all of Egypt by driving out the foreign rulers. This is the kingdom in which the deity Amun-Ra, who we'll talk about in the deity section, pretty much overtook everything as the most supreme god, but this was largely more a natural process. In contrast to the natural rise of Amun-Ra, we get a pharaoh named Amenhotep IV who implemented rather drastic changes to religion under penalty of law. He changed his own name to Akhenaten, enforced the worship of his deity Aten, and forbade the worship of other deities, essentially forcing monotheism. He also picked up the capital city and moved it across the country, literally creating and building a new capital to his own liking. Now, to give a bit of perspective, imagine if a US president tried to force a natural religion and move the capital city. That's about how popular the decision was. It was not very liked at all. In fact, the pharaohs who came after him tried their hardest to erase everything Akhenaten did, even his existence itself, erasing his rule from the records. His son was named Tutankhamun, but after taking control when his father died, he quickly changed his name to Tutankhamun, referencing the return to the aforementioned Amun-Ra as supreme deity. And yes, that is the famous King Tut. The next major pharaoh to come after that was Ramses the Great, who pretty much did everything the most popular and successful pharaohs did, but bigger. He built monuments, expanded the border of Egypt, and had tons of children, literally around 100. He also signed the first official peace treaty in all of history with the country he was at war with. Unfortunately, Egypt had stretched itself too thin and became too big to maintain. This was the last kingdom, the last golden age, and for the next almost 3,000 years, Egypt would be conquered and controlled by various outside forces. After Ramses the Great, his son had a half-successful reign, but then was quickly followed by the successive reign of 3 of his sons. Finally, Ramses XI took over as pharaoh, but because of the usual droughts, famine, civil war, he lost control of Upper Egypt to priests, and control of Lower Egypt to somebody named Smendes, who ended up creating the 21st dynasty, thus creating the third intermediary period. Until the 24th dynasty, there was really just a lot of fractured infighting, until the country to the south, the Kushites from Nubia, took over the place, followed by the Assyrians and then the Persians, going into the final 31 dynasties. That's when someone called Alexander the Great and his army swooped into Egypt, taking control from the Persians. They took over by using the same power structure, i.e. calling themselves pharaohs until Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, took power in 30 BC. As is a pretty well-known piece of trivia, Cleopatra actually lived closer to today than the building of the Great Pyramids. Anyways, Rome had control over ancient Egypt until around 600 AD. Then Islamic invaders took over until the Ottoman invasion in the 16th century. France took control for 3 years around 1800, but then it was the British, until finally, in 1953, that was the first time Egypt was ruled by natives in about those 3,000 years. And so that is a very, very summarized of one of the world's longest civilizations. In the next part in the series, we'll travel back to those kingdoms, dive in and take a closer look at not the events of history, but the actual beliefs, magic, and religion of those people. First, if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like it so I know you guys like some of this more historical-based content. Then, if you want to join the Grimwire gang, be as cool as Fiora, and get mentioned in a shout-out like this, be sure to subscribe, click that bell notification, and then let me know you did so in the comments. Otherwise, thanks for watching, friends. I'll see you around.